Alberto Rios said, "Spirits of the Ordinary is an immediately fresh and engaging weave of voices set earlier in the century," referring to the 20th century, "and ranging easily above any fences separating Mexico and the United States." So I want you to talk about the significance of this book in terms of providing historical information to readers regarding Mexico and the United States.
Well, I felt once I started researching it, which was just based on the story of my great-grandparents, I felt as though this amazing gift had been given to me, just sort of fallen in my lap, because there's so much information that we don't know from that time. It's there, but I think I'm first generation, and I feel as though we were really cut off from that in terms of having a background. It was just, you know, we both grew up in California, and in fourth grade they said, okay, this is the history of this state. Go color in these Native Americans and look at this little mission, and then it's modern times. And you go, wait a minute, what about my family? And nobody ever addresses that. So I felt that researching late 19th century Mexico and the United States just gave me way more material, again, than I could possibly smash into one novel. But I am happy to expose other people to this history, and especially people like us to claim that history and claim this background that people often told us we didn't have. I just read Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. I don't know if you've looked at it.
Haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Yeah, and she talks about this notion of people being disconnected from their roots, being told that they have no history and have no past, which is what happened to Africans who were brought to the United States, is they were just deliberately cut off from all of that. And so I see this as a reclaiming of all of our roots right now, that we can say, yes, this is what's coming in the future, but this is what we bring from the past as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that really drew me into this story, because I don't really know that much about my history, my personal history, but reading about this was very exciting because it still made me feel connected somehow to my past. So
there's more to come. And really, I have to say, I think you're so brave to start with personal stories based on your own life, and then it's such a great grounding to go back and look at things in a larger context.
Well, it's sort of the easy way out, sort of the lazy person's out, because I don't have to do a lot of research.
You don't have to research that. Right?
I know you've done a lot of research, but I also know that you love to do research.
I do.
But also you talked about how lucky you were because you have these stories. And so this is what you write about in the introduction to the reissue of this book, that you write that the people in this novel came to you through stories told by your aunts and uncles at family gatherings, also through the characters of your first book, Mrs. Vargas and the Dead Naturalist, and through visions in your own head, much like those experienced by your characters. And as we mentioned, it's a big cast of characters, all of them fascinating. And I was wondering which of these characters emerged for you first?
Well, that's not too hard because the story was based on my great-grandparents. So the very last story in the collection, Mrs. Vargas and the Dead Naturalist from Calix Books, is based on that story, on the fact that my great-grandfather kept going out into the wilderness and searching for gold, and his wife, my great-grandmother, finally got fed up with the whole thing and had him cut off financially, which was possible at that time. Under the laws of Mexico, people had very different rights and commitments and everything under Napoleonic law than they did under common law, and the basis for American law versus Mexican law. So that I had to do a little bit of research on, but mostly the things that I didn't know, I just sort of jumped over. I just sort of assumed that they were there. And that turned out to to work, that if I knew some things, the things in between filled in logically. So there's a certain leap of faith that I took at certain points, that if A, then B would follow.
So I want to talk about some other characters in the book too. The twins.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
who seem sort of otherworldly, and we don't see them in the same way as we do see the other characters. We see them sort of at a distance. We're not actually in their heads, but we're seeing how other people view them. And so we're seeing them at a distance, which makes them a little bit more unknowable,
Mm-hmm.
which I think adds to their mystery of
Mm-hmm.
who they are. I want you to talk a little bit about what inspired them, if they're based on actual people, and if there exist any omens or beliefs or lore associated with twins that was important to you in terms of putting them in this book.
Well, there's a good story around the twins. My son was really little at that point. He was about 10 months old, maybe a little older. And we went to Sundance. My husband had a conference, and so we went along. And I was right in the middle of writing this book. And so I engaged a babysitter, and I said, take him out and have him walk and run until he's exhausted. Go take a snack and go out. So while they were gone, which was for about 2 hours, I sat down. I knew I wanted to write about the twins, but I was going to write about elderly sisters who were twins, because I used to ride the bus in North Seattle with 2 elderly sisters who were twins, and they dressed exactly the same all the time, down to the little pins on their collars. And I thought, what would it be like to have another who's really you at the same time, a mirror image? But when I sat down to write the twins, the twins in the book, Membrillo and Manzana are who emerged, who are young, androgynous people. And they really took a hold of people's imagination, I have to say. And one reason is twins play a big part in indigenous culture. I think almost every Southwest tribe has a creation story that involves either sisters or twins. And one marries the sky and one marries the earth, and the stars are the result, different variations on that story. So I was happy to have them in there. The other thing is, I think once I wrote about them and realized what was going to happen to them, I deliberately did not bring us close to their consciousness and to their inner consciousness, because they ended up being the red shirts in the story, right? You know, they were going to meet a terrible death. And it's hard on people if you get close to a character and then the author takes them away from you.
Well, I still felt bereft when that happened.
Yes. Well, I did too. I cried. But it just seemed that in many ways, like the indigenous stories, they were being taken away by other people who didn't understand who they were, what they were at all. So,
yeah, it's a fascinating aspect of the book. Now, there's a foreword in the new issue of this book by Rigoberto González. And he points out that Spirits of the Ordinary was ahead of its time in many ways, one of which was the portrayal of women of the time. And as you mentioned, Estella cuts off Zacarías financially.
mm-hmm.
And Magdalena, the character Magdalena, rises above abusive circumstances to money and power. And Corey assumes the guise of a man to practice her profession of photography. Were these kinds of women who broke the mold actually more prevalent than we tend to believe or realize? Did you find that in your research? And also, what did each of these characters represent for you in the book?
Well, in doing the research, yes, in fact, there were women who traveled disguised as men. It was fairly common. So that aspect of it, the photographer coming through these towns, an American photographer, I think from Denver, was based on several accounts of women making their way to the West. Um, Again, in Mexican culture, there was a very different expectation of women. I sometimes say Mexicans were not Victorians. There was not this certain expectation of a type of behavior that made women acceptable in society. So women smoked, they smoked cigars, and had children out of wedlock and were not banned from the upper class society events as a result of that. And there were just a lot of things going on that were very different that I thought, well, I can take advantage of that. And I talk about that more in the third novel, Treasures in Heaven, and how women really tried to get control of their fate at that time, including the vote, trying to get the vote. In terms of what each of them mean to me, that's a really hard question. I have to say, I certainly identified with Corey in terms of being an observer. I'm often an outsider observing other people and thinking about them. And as a writer, I often will flip a story around and say, well, what would this event look like from this person's point of view? And then I'll try it from another person's point of view. And I think it really helps me understand the dynamics of how people interact with each other. But certainly if I'm going to pick one of those people to identify with, it would be Corey. Who else did we talk about? You talked about Magdalena and
Estella.
And Estella. Yeah, I'll stick with Corey of those people.
Well, it's interesting too because each of them represents a different aspect of society during that time.
Yes, yes, and certainly Estella would have been the equivalent of my great-grandmother, who was really fairly rigid in her belief system and in her behavior. She was with the program. She was very much a part of that culture. And as far as Zacarías, there are some other even wilder stories I could have told about my great-grandfather, but they didn't fit into the arc of that story, and so I didn't use them.